All right, so before we get going here, after class today, you'll see the next Module 11 quiz pop up. You'll see the Module 10 top hat reading show up on Canvas. Those will both due by the end of the day Monday. So I'll kind of get those posted once I get back to my office. You'll also see the next Canvas discussion pop up. It'll be due at the end of the week next Friday. I'll go through this at the end of the class, a little bit more, mention more how it's going to be different from the ones that we've done before. Other than that, we'll kind of pick up where we left off using those Monopoly slides. I don't think we'll dive back into the Excel file. I'm going to save a little bit of material. We won't probably quite get through everything that I wanted to this week. You'll have everything you need for the quiz, but we'll kind of touch on a couple other Monopoly concepts at the beginning of next class Tuesday, probably for the first 10 minutes or so. And then we'll kind of jump into Module 12 material. There's a little bit less, so I know that we have a little more time next week. But other than that, that should give us a roadmap of where we're going. Oh, one thing you'll also see pop up, I don't think you can see under the files tab yet, but I've got the practice final exams that I'll get posted up there. I mean, we're still 3 weeks away from final exam week, but I want to get those out there as early as possible. We've covered 2 of the 4 modules after this week that you could be asked questions on, and so the first half of those practice exams, you could already start looking at them and start to think about what these questions are going to look like on the final. Okay. Any other questions for me before we jump into things here today? Okay. So we left off last class. Oh, what do I want? I want this slide. There you go. Thinking about identifying where a single price monopolist, we didn't call it a single price. Today we're going to differentiate between the monopolists we talked about last class and a different type. But they were setting a single price for their product. They did it a little bit differently, which was their marginal revenue curve was not this kind of horizontal line, which was the equilibrium price. They faced a downward sloping demand or downward sloping marginal revenue curve that was twice as steep as demand. So they set the quantity like every other firm that we're going to be talking about, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. Once they do that, they then say, how much are people willing to pay? Well, what represents the willingness and ability to pay? The demand curve. So we went up to the demand curve to set the price. Just like we were doing last week, what are profits? Quantity we produce times the difference between the price and the average total cost. So we said monopolists can have positive profits even in the long run. And we'll kind of revisit maybe why, if you're kind of questioning this, later on in today's class. But for now, just take me at my word. I'll kind of give you more support as to why that can exist. So we're then going to start to think about if they're maximizing profits, they're choosing a quantity that is different from the perfectly competitive quantity. So where would a perfectly competitive market end up at? Where supply is equal to demand. The monopolist isn't getting to that point, right? I don't have supply up here, but what represents supply? If I've got a monopolist, what did supply represent? The marginal costs. If I only have one firm, their marginal cost curve becomes my supply curve in the market. Right? They're the only firm supplying. So I'll kind of give you a simplification that you might see these types of questions pop up on the quiz or the exam. Right? So instead of this upward sloping marginal cost curve, I'm going to simplify this, but all of the concepts that we're going to go through would apply if I had increasing marginal costs. So let's say I've got a demand curve. And the equation that represents that is this, right? Behind every line, there's an equation, right? So it's kind of starting out here at 100. Now, I'm going to make an assumption here and simplify this and say, let's assume that they have a constant marginal cost. Right? I set it here at 20. Okay? So what would marginal cost represent? One firm. So this is our supply curve. Okay? Now, what is going to be true about the marginal revenue curve that a monopolist faces when they set a single price? It's going to start out at the same point as demand, but it's going to be what? Twice as steep. So here it would be minus 10Q. Okay. So where would this single price monopolist set the profit maximizing quantity? Where? So we kind of set I'll write this out here. Where will that monopolist set the profit maximizing quantity? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? So this point right here. Using equations, how would I find that point? Well, what is my marginal revenue? 100 minus 10Q. My marginal cost, I've kept it nice and easy, a constant value of 20. So it's really just a little bit of algebra here, all right? I subtract 20 from both sides, add 10Q to both sides. I've got what? 80 is equal to 10Q. Divide both sides by 10. And I get that the quantity that the monopolist should choose to produce is 8. All right, just one equation, one unknown, it's just a little bit of algebra. So when we say marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, there's equations behind that. We would just set those two equations equal to each other and solve for that quantity that we don't know. One equation, one unknown. Now here I made the math a little bit easier by making marginal cost constant. And we don't have like an actual upward sloping marginal cost, but you do the same thing, the math will just take a little bit more time. Okay. Everybody clear on everything I did here? I'm gonna start adding some things in. So what's the second thing that a monopolist needs to do? Well, they need to figure out what price can I get away with charging consumers? Well, at that quantity of 8, what is the last consumer willing and able to pay? Well, that would be the point where we're at on our demand curve. So I go up to my demand curve to then set that monopoly price. How would I figure out what that value is? Well, if I know that my demand curve has this equation, how do I find the price or the point I'd be at on the demand curve at a quantity of 8? Simply plug in that quantity. So if I want the quantity the monopolist can charge, I just use my demand curve and plug in their profit maximizing quantity. So if I do the math here, I get what? A price of 60. Okay. So this is how the monopolist is going to set their equilibrium quantity and price visually, but then also using equations. Behind every visual on a graph, there are equations that represent these lines. Okay. Now, it gets a little bit trickier here. It's supposed to simplify things, but I don't really need to add in an average total cost curve here, because if every unit I'm adding a cost of $20, what is my average total cost always going to be? Well, the first unit, my total cost will be 20 divided by 1 is 20. If I produce 2 units, each cost me 20. Total cost of 40 divided by 2 is 20. 3, 60 over, right? 3 is going to be 20. So my marginal cost, if it is constant, becomes my average total cost as well. So that kind of helps us out to simplify that, because now visually, what is profits of the monopolist? Well, that's just the quantity I'm selling times the difference between my price and average total cost, right? So here's my monopoly profits. Now, if I wanted to compare this to a perfectly competitive market, what would the perfectly competitive market, what quantity will they end up at? Where supply is equal to demand. What is my supply curve? Well, it's here, and that's a constant value of 20. What's my demand curve? 100 minus 5Q. So if I do the algebra here, I think I get a quantity of what? Minus 20, 80 over 5 is, 16? Okay. So this point where supply is equal to demand, that's my perfectly competitive quantity. Notice it's going to be higher than what the monopolist set. We said when we have a single price monopolist, they always restrict quantity. Now they also end up charging a higher price. What would the price of this perfectly competitive market be? 20. All right, the point where I'm at, where supply is equal to demand. So it ends up just being the same as my marginal cost. Okay. So here the price the perfectly competitive market would choose is the same as my marginal cost. Now, what's happened because I have a monopolist? Well, if I think about, I'm restricting quantity. All of these units are no longer being sold. So what represents total surplus? The difference between my, not my demand. So the difference, well, yeah, sorry. the difference between my supply and demand curves. So that would really represent everything below demand, but above my supply. Well, the monopolist no longer produces these units. So what have we created by having a monopolist? A loss of surplus or deadweight loss. Okay. So with a monopolist, we can solve for these quantities using our equations. We end up finding that the quantity the monopolist produces will be lower than the perfectly competitive quantity, and the price they charge will be above that perfectly competitive price. Okay. So we had this kind of last class. Instead of having this nice constant marginal cost, go back a little bit just to kind of remind us. Oops. Right? We had those same implications even if marginal cost is increasing. Monopolist chooses a lower quantity, sets a higher price. In restricting quantity, when we get to that perfectly competitive outcome, that's where total surplus is maximized. So if we move away from that quantity, what have we created? Deadweight loss, right? So just like with constant marginal cost, even if marginal cost is increasing, we've created some deadweight loss here. So we can also think about the implications this is going to have on producer and consumer surplus. Okay. So this is in the slides, but I don't know. I think it helps to draw this out because that's really what you're going to have to do on the exam. Okay. So if I think about two scenarios, right? So if I have a perfectly competitive market, we know that that equilibrium quantity and that equilibrium price will be right here. Hopefully this is nothing new. We've done this a lot, right? In terms of identifying where the market is at the point where total surplus is maximized, or, from last module, kind of where that long run equilibrium will be, or that efficient scale of production. Now, what we didn't really tie in as much, and this kind of connects with what we were talking about way back in module 5. What is producer surplus, right? It's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers. What's the marginal benefit if I sell something? The price. What's representing my marginal costs? Sorry, the supply curve. So here, my producer surplus would be the area below the price, but above my supply curve. So this is the producer surplus from a perfectly competitive market. Now, we also said consumer surplus, same thing. Difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs, but to consumers. So for consumers, what represented marginal benefits? The demand curve. What was their marginal cost? The price. So we kind of looked at the area below demand, above the price they're paying. Here was our consumer surplus in a perfectly competitive market. If I instead wanted to compare that to a market where we had a monopoly, right? So let me see here. I want to try to get this to be the same point. So let's say, here's my kind of supply and demand curve. So here's the demand. The monopolist faces the entire demand curve. They're the only person selling. Their marginal costs, well, if I only have one firm, their marginal costs represent all of supply. Okay. Now we know that the monopolist will make a decision based off of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So they're going to set the quantity where? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, not out here at that perfectly competitive quantity. So they're restricting quantity. We then said, how do they set the price? They go up to the demand curve, and that's where they'll set this equilibrium, kind of monopoly equilibrium price. So if I think about here, where would producer surplus be? Well, it's the area below price, but above my marginal cost or above the supply curve. So now producer surplus is this entire area when I'm looking at a monopolist. Consumer surplus, the area below my demand curve, but above this new higher price they're paying, this is now consumer surplus with a monopolist. Now, I can draw this out, but intuitively, if monopolists set a higher price, who is that a good thing for? Monopolist, the producer. So producer surplus is going to go up. Who is it a bad thing for? Higher price is bad for consumers. So what happened to consumer surplus relative to before? It's went down. Now, producers lost a little bit of surplus here, but they gained a lot more here. Now, what does this look kind of similar to that we already talked about? It's a government regulation. If I have a higher price, so taxes sound similar, they would restrict quantity, but it won't be the same producer and consumer surplus because with taxes, we now have tax revenue. What created producer and consumer surplus that looked like this? Well, what's something that raises the price? A price floor. Looks very similar to price floors when we have monopoly power. Okay. Now, anything that restricts quantity from that perfectly competitive point, for every unit in this range, what surplus are we losing out on? Well, total surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal costs for the entire market, or the difference between our supply and demand curve. So all of these units are no longer being produced and sold in the market. So we're losing all of that surplus, or that's our deadweight loss. Okay. Any questions on anything here before we keep moving? Okay. To make this point now, and we'll reuse this a little bit later, if I wanted to calculate deadweight loss, okay, what would the height of this triangle be? Well, at this quantity, this is my marginal cost value. So the height of our deadweight loss triangle will always be the difference between the price the monopolist sets and what their marginal cost was at that last unit provided. What will the width of this triangle always be? The number of units that the monopolist underproduced relative to that perfectly competitive market. So you can think about it as like the difference between price and marginal cost. That's essentially like what the value in the market would have been for those units times the number of units no longer being supplied to the market. And then because we have linear supply and demand curves, what else do I have to do here? The area of a triangle, so multiply by half. Okay. So our deadweight loss we can calculate, and it's always going to be the number of units that the monopolist is underproducing by relative to the perfectly competitive market times that difference between our price and marginal cost. So what we're going to call that difference between our price and our marginal cost, we're going to refer to that as the monopolist's markup. Okay. Because if I had a perfectly competitive market, what is true about the price and the marginal cost of the last unit? They would be the same thing. So the markup in a perfectly competitive market is always 0. The markup of a monopolist will always be something. Because why? Once we choose where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost to get the quantity, the second step was to go up to the demand curve to set the price. So the price will always be above the marginal cost of the last unit provided to the market for the monopolist. Okay. Any questions on this before we jump back into the slides here? Okay. So here was kind of our producer consumer surplus deadweight loss, right? We said consumer surpluses are hurt. Consumer surplus is hurt by monopoly power. Producer surplus, is increased or is kind of improved. Okay. Now, if I gave you a question like this, we can see what the answer is, right? But I've got this kind of depiction. So just to kind of hit on some things we've already talked about. And I'll kind of get back to a table example that we skipped over last class. Where would the perfectly competitive market arrive at? Where supply is equal to? Got to know this before we get to the exam. Perfectly competitive markets will end up where supply is equal to demand, right? So it'd be out here. Well, what is true? That's at a quantity of 22.5 and a price of 27.5. This is the same visual we used last class. What is true about the price relative to my average total cost? So at that perfectly competitive quantity, price is exactly equal to my average total cost, or profits are equal to 0. We must be in the long run. That's where profits are 0 at a perfectly competitive market. Now, Where does the monopolist choose? Where their marginal costs are equal to their marginal revenues. That's at a quantity of 15. So they're restricting quantity by 7.5 units. They then do what to set the price? Go up to the demand curve. This is how much the consumer was willing to and able to pay. I'll charge them that exact amount. That looks like here it's at 35. So 35 minus 20 is the difference between the price and the marginal cost. That'd be 15. The number of units being underproduced, 22.5 to 15, so 7.5. 7.5 times 15 does not give me 56.25. Why? What did I forget? Deadweight loss is the area of a triangle, so I need to then multiply by 1/2. Okay? So that's how we could calculate deadweight loss. Any questions here? So I'm going to go back to some things that we skipped over last class and think about how could I answer these questions based off of what we've talked about. Okay? So this first one, I'll just talk through because I think it's fairly simple. Right? Where does the monopolist set the profit maximizing quantity? Where what is equal to what? Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So I know marginal revenue will not be greater than marginal cost if I'm a profit maximizing monopolist. They'll be equal. Now, once I find that quantity, what do I always do to set the price? I go up to the demand curve. So my price will always be above that marginal revenue and marginal cost value. So we know the price will be above marginal revenue and marginal cost, but marginal revenue and marginal cost will be the exact same thing. Right? So we would answer kind of C here. Okay. Now, if instead I had, sort of equations instead of a nice visualization, I had a table. Right? So I'm going to keep the marginal cost nice and constant here at 5, just to make it a little bit easier. How would I calculate? Let's say I just gave you the price and the quantity. How would I calculate total revenues? Simply my price that I'm selling the good for times the number of units I'm selling, or price times quantity. So 0 times 10 is 0, 5 times 9 is 45, 10 times 8 is 80, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why did I want to calculate total revenues? Because to set the optimal quantity, I have to set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. Well, I can't find marginal revenue without total revenue because it's the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. In some of the examples we looked at last class, I was keeping the change in quantity nice and easy at 1. That won't always be the case. So here, if I'm going from 0 to 5 units, what was the change in my total revenue? I went from 0 to 45, so the change in total revenue was 45. Divided by a change in the number of units, my units were going up by 5. 45 over 5 gives me a marginal revenue of 9. And then change in total revenue going from 5 to 10 is what? 35 divided by 5 would be 7, et cetera, et cetera. I could fill in that marginal revenue column. Where will I set the profit maximizing price as a single price monopolist? Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Well, here we have kind of a weird one because when I have a table, what I do is I go through and say, well, I produce those first 5 units. Well, the marginal revenue is 9. That's greater than my marginal cost, so I'm making money off of those units. So yes, I'll produce the first 5. Will I produce the next 5, going from 5 to 10? Well, marginal revenue is 7. My marginal cost is 5, so yes. What about those next 5, going from 10 to 15? Well, my marginal revenue is 5. Is that greater than or equal to my marginal cost? It's equal, so yes, I'll produce those next 5. Will I go from 15 to 20? Well, now my marginal revenue is below my marginal cost, so no. So I don't produce the 20th unit, I stop at 15 here. Okay? Now, if I instead had asked you for the price, why did I put in 7 and 8 there? As distracting answers. So I just found the profit maximizing quantity. Visually, I said, how do we find the price? We go up to the demand curve. What represents my demand curve here? The combinations of price and quantity. So at that quantity of 15, how much would consumers be willing and able to pay? $7. So if I had like a 2-part question here, the profit maximizing quantity is 15, and then the profit maximizing price would be 7, right? The price is associated with that quantity or that point on the demand curve. Okay. Now, what if I had a unique example where marginal costs were 0? So I'll kind of revisit some stuff we talked about last class here. What I would do is I'd go through every quantity. If the marginal revenue is greater than or equal to 0, I produce it. So, if my costs were 20 before and I produce the first 15 with lower cost, I'll still produce them, right? Will I now go produce the 20th unit? Well, there my marginal revenue is 3. That's greater than 0, so yes. Will I produce the 25th unit? Marginal revenue is 1, greater than or equal to 0, so yes. Now here we don't have an equal point because if I go from 25 to 30, my marginal revenue is -1. That's less than 0. I would never produce, right, that 30th unit. So even if my marginal costs were 0, I'll kind of stop where that marginal revenue, the last unit where marginal revenue was greater than or equal to. Here the So notice, even with a marginal cost of 0, what will be true? My marginal revenues will always be 0 or positive. If they're positive, we said that demand was what? So at the point where marginal revenue is equal to 0, we said we're on the point of the demand curve where we are unit elastic, right? So at the very worst, even if marginal costs were 0, we would be at that unit elastic point. Anytime we have any marginal costs, right, which is more like the real world, we're always going to be at a point where if marginal costs are positive, we set quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue would be positive. If marginal revenue is positive, we said we're on the portion of the demand curve that is elastic. Okay, so just kind of revisiting some things we talked about last class. Okay. So we can do this with equations, tables, or kind of these nice, if I skip ahead here, kind of visualizations, right? If I have some actual like graph, right, some numbers on a graph. So this was all for single price monopolists, right? They were setting a single price. We're next going to talk about what we call price discriminating monopolists. So we'll first start out with if I can perfectly price discriminate, how is that going to vary from if I can set a single price? So what does price discrimination look like? So this is basically just that I can identify characteristics of consumers that tells me whether or not they're willing to pay more or less. This is a very, 50 years ago, this wasn't as relevant, right? But now, every time you buy something on Amazon, they're collecting data on you. So what do? Suggest other products to you. Maybe they give you deals they don't give to others, right? I always think about, I don't even know how to say it, Temu or whatever it is, right? They're always giving these like exploding offers that lower the price, and maybe they're giving you a different offer than they are to someone else. If they were smart, they would do that. Because based off your purchase history, they might know you're willing to pay more for this type of a product. Whereas if you're not, if you don't usually buy this good, they might have to lower the price for you to convince you to buy it. So if I can use data to identify differences in consumers, and some consumers, based off of their characteristics, are willing to pay more or less for a good, I could charge them different prices. So I'll have some more examples, but for right now, we'll kind of just think about price discrimination's impacts on the market. Okay? So if I'm thinking about a scenario where I only have a single price monopolist, right? So we kind of start out here. I'm setting a single price where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. My producer surplus, or the difference between price, if I have a horizontal marginal cost is the supply of the firm. So that difference between the price and the supply curve, that's our profits or our producer surplus. The area above the price below demand, that's our consumer surplus. And then we're no longer producing any of these units. This would be our deadweight loss. Well, if I can identify that this first consumer is willing to pay $100, if I can figure out who that is, how much do I want to charge them? If I know they'll pay $100, I want to charge them 100. They'd be indifferent, so maybe 99.9999, right? Now, if I was to charge everyone that price, the second consumer would not buy that. They might be only willing to pay $80. So if I could figure out who that is, I would want to charge them what price? $80, exactly how much they're willing to pay. I continue to do that, and what happens is when I set that single price, nobody past this point would have been willing to buy the good. But if I can identify who this is and charge them a lower price, well, that lower price is still above my marginal cost. I could be making money off them if I could charge more than just one price. This would continue up to the point where the value the consumer would pay is exactly equal to my marginal cost. So if I can price discriminate, I will sell more units, right? And what am I doing by selling more units? I'm moving closer to that perfectly competitive quantity. Deadweight loss would be going down. Okay? So here was kind of a constant marginal cost example. If I can perfectly price discriminate, my demand curve, that's how I'm charging consumers these different prices. So what is producer surplus? The difference between the price I'm charging, which is now the demand curve, and my marginal cost. All of total surplus now becomes producer surplus. What is consumer surplus? Well, if I'm charging people exactly what their marginal benefit is, what's the consumer surplus? 0. So I can get to this perfectly competitive quantity. Deadweight loss, if I could perfectly price discriminate, is actually equal to 0. But all of that surplus is producer surplus. Do we likely want that as a society? Well, if we're all voting, probably not, right? We're consumers. We would like there to be some consumer surplus. So this would take place even if we didn't have a nice constant marginal cost. So if you were kind of drawing out what perfect price discrimination looks like. So if I had instead increasing marginal costs, I've got my demand curve. We'll compare this to a single price monopolist. So the single price monopolist would be setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, going up here, the demand curve to set the price. So the consumer and producer surplus, we said, here would have been consumer surplus, the area below demand, but above the price they're paying. Here would have been producer surplus, the area below price, but above their marginal costs or above the supply curve. So we had this exact thing drawn out earlier. And we said, here would be our deadweight loss because we were underproducing relative to that perfectly competitive quantity. Now, if I can perfectly price discriminate, I don't make a decision based off this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. That was only twice as steep because I was setting a single price. So when we were going to those like equations, taking a derivative, that was why our marginal revenue curve was twice as steep. If I can charge consumers exactly what their marginal benefit is, my marginal revenue curve actually becomes the demand curve. And how much is my marginal revenue on each unit? It's these different prices that the price discriminating monopolist can choose. So not setting a single price, they're charging a different price at every single quantity, or you can think about every single consumer they're charging a different price to. So now, where does the price discriminating monopolist choose? Where their marginal revenue is equal to their marginal cost. Consumer surplus, well, if that's the difference between the demand curve and the price they pay, that's now the same thing. It's got driven down to where it existed before. It's now 0, right? So this price discriminating surplus for consumers is now 0. Now, what about producer surplus? So that should be the difference between the price they're charging and their supply curve or their marginal cost curve. What is that now for every unit? Well, the price I charge the first consumer is here. Here's my marginal cost. So here's like the producer surplus of that first unit. What about the second unit I'm selling or the second person I sell to? Lower price, but it's still above my marginal cost. I'm still making money or having producer surplus from selling that second unit. That would exist all the way up into the point where the price I can charge is equal to my marginal cost. So with a price discriminating monopolist, this entire area becomes producer surplus. We've gotten to the perfectly competitive quantity. So if we're not underproducing, we've caused no deadweight loss. The deadweight loss will be 0. Consumer surplus is 0. and all of total surplus becomes producer surplus. Okay. So we don't need to kind of have this constant marginal cost depiction. It would apply to increasing marginal cost as well. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? All right. So what we will do now is take the next 5 minutes, right? So we'll do what? 10. I'll give us a little bit of a buffer here. So the code for today, oh, sorry. It's already 10:10. Hold on. Let me change this real quick. I meant to do 10:16 here. All right, so we got the next 5 minutes. I believe the code on this is 11.17. So that'll get you into the quiz. I'll give you the next 4 or 5 minutes to kind of work on this. I'll give you a prompt in a minute here. So 4 minutes. I'll tell you to get it submitted, and then we'll kind of talk about these. Okay. So talk to the people around you. Next 4 minutes should look very similar to what we just talked about. So these shouldn't be too difficult. So get the next 4 or 5 minutes to kind of work on these. Okay. Once again, talk to the people around you, work on these together. It's 22 milligrams. Oh, yeah. Because you don't, yeah, it's already stored. This is all totals. Wait, what did you get? And also, all the sum changes are at first, that was the average, right? Yeah, if it's all producer surplus, who else can have surplus? Yeah. All right. So I have the time set to be 10:16. So kind of make sure you're getting your answers clicked and submitted here before that due time of 10:16 is over. We'll kind of start talking through them, but we're not going to cover them before that. So make sure you're hitting submit now. Otherwise, I don't think you were here. If you have any technical issues, when do you need to talk to me by? The end of class. Okay. So we have this perfect price discriminating monopolist. Okay. If I'm thinking about kind of these second two first, right? So how are they setting that profit maximizing quantity? So they're always going to set that profit maximizing quantity where what is equal to what? Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Now I drew in a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, but for a price discriminating monopolist, that's not their marginal revenue. The marginal revenue curve is only twice as steep if I'm setting a single price. So what becomes the price discriminating monopolist marginal revenue? Demand. I'm choosing the price that I know consumers will be willing or able to pay. So where would my marginal revenue for a price discriminating monopolist for the demand curve, hit my marginal cost? Looks like it's out here at a quantity of 22.5. Hold on, my grid lines are a little off here. So what? Yep, 22.5, which was the same as the quantity of the same as the quantity of what market? Perfectly competitive, where supply is equal to demand. Any questions on that idea? Now, this is where, if we're paying attention in class, I built even a model out and just talked about this. If I can perfectly price discriminate, so we just said we got to the same quantity as a perfectly competitive market. What is maximized when I have a perfectly competitive market? Total surplus. We've gotten to that point where supply is equal to demand, the efficient point for the market. It's efficient because that's where total surplus is maximized. So if I have a perfect price discriminating monopolist and I get to that same quantity, I'm maximizing total surplus, so I've caused zero deadweight loss. Now, if I'm charging every consumer exactly how much they're willing to pay, every consumer's surplus would be what? Zero. Right? So we said when we have perfect price discrimination, consumer surplus is zero, deadweight loss is zero, and what would producer surplus be? Producer surplus, we said, would be the same as total surplus, right? Or that area in between supply and demand. Because we have one firm, their marginal cost represents supply. So if I wanted to calculate this here, it looks like it's what? 5 to 50 times 22.5 times a half. That wasn't one of the questions I asked you, but you could calculate producer surplus. It would be all of total surplus here. Okay. Any questions on this idea? So consumers are hurt by price discrimination. Producers are helped by this. Okay. So let's go back to the slides here. So we kind of talked through this a little bit, but I'll give you some more examples where we can kind of think about how this plays out. So how can I, like, if I'm a firm, who am I going to want to charge a lower price to? If somebody is really responsive to price changes, if I lower the price a little bit, I'm going to be able to sell them a lot more units. So if I can figure out who is more or less elastic, I want to charge people who are more elastic lower prices. If they're inelastic, they're going to buy the same amount no matter what the price is. I want to charge them a higher price. So here we can kind of think about some different examples, right? I'll skip ahead here. We'll kind of come back to this. But what are some examples we see in the real world? So even if I can't perfectly price discriminate, what I want to do is based off of data or what I know is try to figure out who I can charge higher prices to, or who I might want to charge lower prices to. So really good kind of examples of this is maybe I use a characteristic of age and I charge people different prices based off their age. Well, you might think, how do I do that? Well, I said movie tickets here. It's kind of an old example because I'm getting old. But if you think about I don't know, when you guys go out to different places, what do they sometimes have that applies to you that wouldn't apply to me? Student discounts, right? Why are they charging you lower prices? They know that you're probably not working a full-time job, or most college students have lower abilities to pay. So they've identified this characteristic that you're a student. They know that your demand curve is going to be lower. You're not willing and able to pay as high of a price. If they charge a single price, you might not buy it. Now, what's another example of this? Maybe if I know there's certain times where people aren't as likely to kind of be buying my product. So the movie ticket example one, they used to have like, matinees, or if you look at like places that have plays, they know most people are working in the middle of the day. So if I want to convince them to take off work and go to this thing, I have to charge them a lower price, right? I identify characteristics that would increase or decrease demand for my product at various times or to various different consumer bases. What I might also do is think about, these early bird specials. I'm trying to kind of target like seniors or offer senior discounts. Why? Because they're usually retired, they're on fixed incomes, their ability and willingness to pay is lower. So to convince them to buy my product, I might charge them a slightly lower price, but keep the price to everybody else still what it was before. Okay. Now, you could also think about like discount coupons. It may not only be like different consumer bases, but the same consumer. We know that as I buy more of something, I'm willing to pay a lower price. So maybe for the first 2 units, you pay whatever the price is at the grocery store, but you're not going to buy a third and a fourth. So what can that grocery store do to convince you to buy that? How does it lower the price? Maybe it says if you buy 3, you get the fourth one free. What does that essentially do? It lowers the price of the third and fourth unit. They keep charging you the same price for the first and the second, but they lower the price to convince you to buy a couple more units that you wouldn't have bought before. So quantity discounts, kind of weird, the word discrimination, you think about like different groups, could be the same consumer, but you know that they're willing to pay more or less for different quantities of the same good. Okay. So this is kind of quantity discounting, kind of a similar idea. But need-based financial aid, I think this is a good one. I can get you some good examples. So you're all not paying the same price to be here, right? So based off of kind of income, they know that certain individuals, if you don't have as much income, you might not be able to pay tuition at IU. You might choose a different lower institution that has lower tuition. So what do? If they want to convince you to be here, they lower the price. Probably still making money off of you, which means that if you don't have need-based financial aid, they're making more money off of you than these other students. Right? Now, that's an example of price discrimination. So another one that I've been thinking about recently that was a good example. So do you think that universities offer you like scholarships and reduction tuition because they just want to be nice because you've done really well in high school? Well, there's an incentive that you might like do better and that makes their college look better. But if you do better in high school, what do you have? More options about where you could attend. If you have more options, when IU increases the price, you can be really elastic. All right. So what do they want to do? What do they want to make sure they do? Lower the price for you. Right. They make sure you don't go somewhere else. Right. Try to draw in kind of these higher ability individuals by lowering the price to them. Maybe not on the scholarships. What else do you see other than just like being smart? Scholarships go to maybe student athletes, right? Or how can I lower the cost for a student athlete who's really, really good, who has a bunch of different options? I can give them a bunch of NIL money. What does that essentially do? It lowers the cost to them attending IU. Right? So this is a really good kind of current real world example where we're price discriminating. A lot of these student athletes aren't paying the same price as you are to be here. Not for them to whatever, right? That's just the way it is, right? That's what the university is doing. That's how they can profit maximize using price discrimination. Okay. So these are some examples that we have. I wanted to kind of work through an example where we don't have perfect price discrimination. So let's say I'm setting a single price, marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. I'm selling 20 units for $300. I'm making money. I've got positive profits. But if I could identify who these first 10 consumers are, I know they're willing to pay a higher price. So even if I can't perfectly price discriminate, if I can figure out who would be willing to pay the highest prices, I don't know exactly who, but I figure out the first 10, I can charge them a higher price. I know they'll be willing to pay it. So for those first 10, I'm not charging a price of 300, I'm charging a price of 400. I can make more money on it. Right? I could increase my profits by what? If I'm charging the first 10 consumers $100 more, I can increase my profits by 1,000. Now, I still sell those next 10 consumers that same price as I was before, so I'm making the same amount of money off of them. However, as a single price monopolist, I didn't sell to anyone past this 20th consumer. If I can figure out that I could sell to maybe seniors if I offer them a discount and I offer them a lower price, maybe they will now buy my product, so I can sell to 10 more people if I can figure out what that group is and offer them a lower price. So before I wasn't selling these units. So how much additional money am I now making? That difference between my price and marginal cost times those next 10, I'm making an additional $1,000 off of those consumers as well. So with price discrimination, even if it's not perfect, I will sell more units and I'm increasing my profit, or I'm increasing producer surplus. Now, if this wasn't perfect price discrimination, with a single price monopolist, here was my consumer surplus, here was my deadweight loss. What triangles would represent consumer surplus here? So consumer surplus is the difference between the demand curve and the price they pay. So these three little triangles, I would still have some consumer surplus. I haven't driven it to zero. That was like my perfect price discrimination, but I still decreased it. Now, what has happened to my deadweight loss? What triangle would that be? Well, the perfectly competitive quantity would be where the demand hits marginal cost. So now I'm only losing out on not 20 units, but I'm losing out only on like 10 here. So with price discrimination, even if it's not perfect, I'm decreasing consumer surplus and I'm decreasing deadweight loss, increasing producer surplus. Now, I won't ask you like non-perfect price discriminating questions on like the exam or the quiz. We'll use the extreme that says the same thing, right? When we had perfect price discrimination, consumer surplus not just went down, it went all the way down to 0. Deadweight loss didn't just go down, it went all the way down to 0. Okay. So we don't have to have perfect price discrimination. The directional changes in these surplus values would stay the same. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So kind of skip through this here. We talked through these examples. This is a good example, but I'm gonna think I can make it make a little more sense. Okay. So I've got this depiction here of regulation of what we call a natural monopoly. Okay. So just to make a point before we go to the slides, let's say I had this natural monopoly. We'll see why this is a little bit different than maybe just having monopoly power, or we can keep firms out. Just we said, if I have monopoly power, what would firms want to do? Well, if there's positive profits, if there are no barriers to entry, like legal restrictions or patents, other firms are going to want to join that market. As they do that, what happens to the price? More competition, the price is going to go down. So in this scenario, with one firm, I do have positive profits, but they're pretty small. If a second firm joins this market and we have the exact same product, we're not going to face all of demand, we're only going to face half of it. So my demand curve that as a firm I face would be half what it was before. Maybe now that price is going to be below my average total cost for both firms, and their profits would be negative. If there's negative profits, what will one firm choose to do? Exit the market. We're back to a monopolist earning some positive profits. And that's because if we have really large costs, like local monopolies exist, like electric companies, because if we had competing electric companies, it would drive the price down too much. Both firms have negative profits. What is one firm going to do? Exit the market. We're going to be back to a monopoly. So sometimes when we have monopolists, the reason why other firms don't join is not because of patents, legal restrictions by the government. It's because the current cost structure, every other firm looks at this and says, well, if we join this market, we only get half of demand. That would actually result in negative profits. So we're not going to win a joint. So we kind of get stuck with this natural monopoly. One firm is all that the current demand and cost could support in this market. So that's a bad thing because they're still restricting quantity from where that perfectly competitive point would be. Now, the problem is if I, as the government, came in and said, look, I'm going to regulate this market. I know that there's a natural monopoly locally for electric companies. I'm going to make them charge this price. Let's say I had a command and control economy. I come in and say, hey, throw you in jail or kill you if you don't charge this price. Right? Well, the problem is if I set the price at the perfectly competitive quantity, what would be true about profits? Price is below average total cost, so profits would be negative. If I lower the price, what's that firm going to want to do if there's negative profits? Leave. So I might think I've eliminated deadweight loss because I got it to the perfectly competitive quantity. But if I'm at that quantity and the firm leaves, what is deadweight loss? The entire market, right? So I can't regulate these natural monopolies to that point where deadweight loss is zero. But what I can do, and here I don't have to have just constant marginal costs. Let's think about a more real world scenario. So if I've got quantity here, I've got my average total cost. Let's say here's my demand curve. Here's my marginal revenue curve. Okay. And I want marginal cost, let me think. Oops. Well, it should hit the average total cost at its minimum point, but I can still make the same kind of point here. Okay. So let's say, in fact, let's just make sure it hits it at its minimum point there, right? So marginal cost is hitting average total cost at its minimum point. Where would the monopolist, single price monopolist choose? Where marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. So we're getting away from price discriminating back to a single price monopolist. They set the price right here. Average total cost is down here. They're earning some positive profits. Okay. If the government comes in, we said, and tries to set the price equal to that perfectly competitive price, right? So here would be kind of like our perfectly competitive price and quantity. If we regulate it to this point, price is below average total cost, profits are negative, we lose the entire market. So what can I use, first of all, to lower the price in the market? I could use a price ceiling. If I put a price ceiling right here, right? So kind of here's my price ceiling. I've lowered the price. Essentially, I could now think about it as how much would they be willing to produce? Well, I'd be out here, marginal revenue, that price that they can now charge is still above their marginal cost. So this would be like my quantity with regulation. And at this new price, what is true? So this is kind of like my new price with regulation. That price is equal to average total cost. So I've driven profits down to zero. So I can regulate this by setting a price ceiling that results in profits being equal to zero. Now, I still am not at the perfectly competitive quantity, so I would still have some deadweight loss with regulation, but compared to what it was before, I've reduced that deadweight loss, right? So this kind of green area was my deadweight loss without regulation, just a single price natural monopolist. I can't eliminate deadweight loss altogether, but I can decrease it, right? So if we have a natural monopoly, what can the government do? Use a price ceiling that reduces the price, the bad thing for the monopolist, it decreases their profits. At the point where profits are equal to zero, they're indifferent. They could stay or leave the industry. I've increased the quantity they'll produce. It's not quite that perfect competitive quantity, so it won't eliminate deadweight loss, but it'll reduce it. Right? I'm moving closer to that perfectly competitive quantity with this regulation. Okay. Yeah. So I could also use subsidies to increase that quantity. However, even though I'm reducing deadweight loss from not being at the perfectly competitive point, what did we say subsidies are also going to create? Some deadweight loss of their own, right? So I could use subsidies to increase that quantity, move closer, but it gets a little bit more complicated, right? But yes, we might have other types of regulation we could use to push us closer to that perfect competitive quantity. I won't ask you questions about that because it's a lot of graphs and it gets a little more confusing. So I'm reducing deadweight loss by lowering monopoly power, but there's going to be some deadweight loss coming from now. I now have this government expenditure. If I use price ceilings or price floors, I don't have any of this additional tax revenue or government kind of expenditures to worry about. Yep. Any other questions here before we keep moving? Okay. So we can regulate these markets, just not to the point where a perfectly competitive market would be, because if we do that, profits are negative, the firm leaves, we lose the entire market. Okay. So we'd have to be really careful, right? So what ends up being true is we'll set that price where it would be exactly equal to the average total cost, where I have zero profits. We said, what's the idea? How can we do this? Well, I kind of use a price ceiling. Or technically, the government could just take over that industry and kind of set the price themselves, right? We don't see that typically in most of our developed economies. But if you go back to, like I said, managed control economy, you can see that happen. Maybe the post office could be an example. There's something else I wanted to say here, and now it left my mind. Oh, I had someone ask me in my office hours yesterday, and just to kind of make a point here, I think it applies. If profits are zero, sometimes I get the question where it's like, well, then why would the firm stay in their industry? Why do I want positive profits? Remember, we're talking about economic profits. So economic profits being zero means there's nothing else with my resources I could be doing to earn higher profits. So I still have accounting profits. Like these firms are still making money. It's just that when there's zero profits, there's no other thing they could do with their resources to make more money. So which is why they still want to stay in this industry. It's still the best option. It's still the option that has their profits being the highest possible value. It's just when we calculate economic profits, when they're zero, what that's saying is there's no other option that's better than what I'm currently doing. There's no other market that would provide me with higher profits than the current market I'm in. So that's why they stay when they have zero economic profits, right? Up to that point. Okay. Now, if I'm not exactly sure what the firm's costs look like, I might want to err on the side of caution. I might not want to try to cause the regulation right to this point. Maybe I, put the prices a little bit higher to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. But, that would be kind of theoretically, if I knew the exact cost of the firm, I'd want to set it right at that point. And I drew this out already for you. I had a blank slide talking about kind of regulation. Okay. I'm going to skip over. This is kind of like, I don't know. We see the post office, we have regulations. These are kind of summary slides. To be honest, they're kind of throwaway slides. But I'm going to draw this out and make some points. So I've got this in the slides, but I think I can do a little bit better of a job here drawing this out for you. So let's say I've got something that looks like this. Okay. So say I've got this market, and this is bleeding through, so I'll get rid of this for a second. So let's say I've got this demand curve. I'm going back to thinking about single price monopolists, and here's my initial marginal costs. Okay. So we said the monopolist sets that quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. They go up to the demand curve to then set the price. Okay. So one thing I introduced earlier, because I wanted to reuse it at this point, was at this quantity, here's the marginal cost of the firm. What did I say the difference? We had a term for it. That difference between the price and the marginal cost, we would call this the firm's markup, right? So initially, like this is my firm's markup. We then said, okay, what is deadweight loss? Well, it would be if I was at the point where supply is equal to demand or at that perfectly competitive quantity, it's all the surplus I lost out on or the area in between supply and demand because the market is underproducing, right? In fact, we even said, just a kind of reminder, we could think about that first part of our deadweight loss equation is the difference between price and marginal cost. That's the height of our triangle. This would be kind of times the number of units that we're seeing the monopolist underproduce by, times a half. Okay. Now, let's say that this firm is able to identify something like a new technology, and they're able to lower their marginal costs. Okay. So at every single point, you go back all the way to module 3. New technologies will shift our supply curve. Lower cost means we'll supply more, right? So I'll do a really extreme example here. Let's say this is a really good technology, right? I've lowered my costs a lot. Where would my new profit maximizing quantity be? Out here where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. I can now charge this point that I'm at in the demand curve or a much higher price. Notice what has happened to my markup, right? Or what's the difference? I didn't leave myself enough room. What's that difference between price and marginal cost now? It's gotten a lot larger. Now, why is that happening? Well, if I have lower marginal cost, the optimal quantity is going to be higher than it was before. That difference between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve, what is it doing as I produce more units? It's getting larger, right? This is the idea. If I produce 5 units, or sorry, if I was at the point of 5 units on demand, it'd be like 10 and 5, right? Because it's twice as steep. Well, if I'm at 20 to 10, that difference is 10. That difference is just growing, right? And we can kind of see that visually. So if I'm producing a higher number of units because of these lower costs, my markup is going up. Now, if my markup goes up, what's happening to my deadweight loss? Remember, markup was like the height of that deadweight loss triangle. So if my markup goes up, I'm going to have more deadweight loss. Or I could think about now, where would the new perfectly competitive quantity be? Where supply or my marginal costs are equal to demand. Here's the quantity the firm is producing. Here's kind of my new deadweight loss in this first scenario relative, in the second scenario relative to the first, deadweight loss is a larger triangle, right? And that's because as I produce more, the size of that markup is going to be increased. So kind of go through this. Who is this likely going to be a bad thing for? Consumers. It's going to help out producers, right? Now that I won't ask you that type of a question. It would be a lot harder of a graph to draw. But we do want to know this relationship between lowering our marginal costs and the fact that that would increase my markup and then consequently increase my deadweight loss in this market. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. Now, I didn't draw in my average total cost curves here, but I could. It's actually something that we'll kind of touch on next class. I'll save that, right, based off where we're at. But I'll talk through intuitively something we'll do at the beginning of next week. So the beginning of next week, I'll think about what happens if we have not changes in marginal cost, but maybe I'm able to like eliminate fixed costs and just shift my average total cost curve, right? Kind of the implications that might have on profits. I'll also start to think about what if I had shifts in demand? Well, if I increase the demand curve, right, or the demand curve increases because there's more consumers or whatever it is, if these two lines kind of shift, where's the new equilibrium quantity going to be? A higher point. We said at higher points, what's going to happen to that gap between demand and marginal revenue? It's going to grow. So increases in demand will have very similar effects as marginal cost decreases in terms of that markup size. So we'll look at that kind of next class. I'll also talk about, I think we'll have time, like I said, based off of how much material is in Module 12. There's a little bit less material in Module 12. So we'll do a little bit, finish up some stuff on monopolies. If you look at the quiz this week, pay attention to the last question. I'm likely going to embed the answer into it, all right? Once it's over, I'll probably just rescore it to make sure everyone's getting full credit. We haven't quite got there thinking about that average total cost change. So everyone should, get credit in that last question, but I'll probably just throw the answer in there to make sure you select the right one. Okay? Now, before you get all ready to go, packed up, I do want to go through this. Now, the instructions are in the assignment, and this will pop up after class, but I want to kind of talk through how this discussion assignment is going to look a little bit different than the first three. So you're going to have 2 articles. Your first, so there's still 4 ways, 4 categories to earn 5 points in each category, similar to what we had before. So your initial post now is going to be taking one of these 2 articles, taking that link, and then putting in the following prompt that I give you in that option. So whether or not you want to use ChatGPT, Gemini, Notebook LM, Copilot, your favorite AI tool that I know you're all using for this point, right? Take the link for the article and then post in that question that's in kind of quotation marks there and have AI tell you a response to that question. Right? Once you have that response, your original post now will be to post what AI told you, and then you need to critique why what it told you based off what we've talked about in class might be incorrect. Now, you can also mention why what it told you is correct based off of what we talked about in class. Okay, so you're all using the same exact prompt. You're going to get similar answers. The part of this assignment you now have to do is evaluate the answer I gave you and identify reasons why, more often than not, these are parts of it is, so why it might be wrong based off what we talked about in class. It might not incorporate as difficult concepts in this initial prompt as we actually went through in class. Okay? So I know that it won't because I'm telling you what that prompt is. That is the prompt you use. So once you have your kind of initial post, you will also take this third article or link. It's a data source, kind of similar to been using data. You will copy paste the link to that data source and then put in this prompt. Whoops, I just went down too far. That's in quotation marks here. Looking at that AI's response, you will have to look at that data set and tell you, did it grab the data correctly? Did it connect it to that question correctly? Essentially, once again, evaluating that AI's response based off what we talked about in class and identify whether or not it's getting things wrong, whether or not it's pulling wrong data from this source, because it will do that. I've played around with this. Is why I'm doing this assignment. I know it's for some of you going to get things very wrong. Right? So the first 2 parts where you earn 5 points each, choose one of those articles. You only have to do one of these options. Evaluate AI's response. Do that kind of data link. Evaluate its response. Those are 5 points each. In both of those, mention the AI tool that you use. That's in the instructions as well. So some of you will use Notebook LM, some of you will use Chat, whatever your favorite AI is. The final 2 parts will be, once you see someone else's evaluation of their AI response, you will respond to one of those initial prompts from another student and say why their evaluation, maybe they said AI was correct, and you look at it and you go, no, you missed this. They actually got this part wrong. So you're evaluating another student's evaluation of the AI output. Right? This is what we call kind of like peer review. Right? So these are kind of tools and skills you'll want to develop while you're here, not just in the context of AI, but in general. That's worth 5 points. The final kind of thing for those final 5 points is you're all going to put in your initial posts what AI tool you use. So you will then look for someone else for the same part, whether it was option 1, 2, or this second kind of part using the data source, who used a different AI tool than you did. You will then need to put in your response to that student's response, how their AI's response differed from yours. Because when you use these different generative AI tools, some of them get something wrong differently than others. Some of them will give you different answers than others. So that fourth kind of part is responding to another student and seeing why what they got from AI was different from what you got, right? And identify maybe any differences or incorrect or correct things that your AI tool got that theirs didn't, right? So you're still really responding to 2 other students' posts, and you're still creating 2 initial posts of your own. It's just all of it is now kind of evaluating AI. Because I know you're all used to it. I'm not kidding. All right? It's something that we kind of have had in previous semesters. It's trying to create, those who like took it serious and actually wanted to kind of have some peer-to-peer interaction in the class with 300, you're able to do that. Now I'm still going to have this kind of peer review, peer interaction. It's just, I know you're going to be using the same prompts in AI, and you're now actually going to be doing kind of this closing the loop, the final step that you should be using when you're using these AI tools, which is to evaluate those responses you got. And I actually think the most interesting thing is going to be for this assignment, hopefully you guys kind of see this, is this fourth thing, right? Seeing the differences that different AI tools give you from the exact same prompt might surprise some. So that is this kind of fourth Canvas discussion. Fifth one might look similar in terms of some change in the way that it goes a little bit. Other than that, you'll see that quiz, top hat reading pop up that are due Monday. This is due next Friday. Enjoy the nice weather. Have a fun, safe weekend. I will see you on Tuesday.